I am very pleased to welcome you to the launch of Unmaking Sex, the Gender Outlaws of 19th Century France by Anne Linton. I am now going to briefly introduce you to our esteemed panel before stepping aside. Anne Linton is Associate Professor of French at San Francisco State University. She is the author of Unmaking Sex, the Gender Outlaws of 19th Century France, published by Cambridge in 2022, and co-editor of Photography in the Body in 19th Century France, a special volume of Yale French Studies, as well as numerous essays on diverse aspects of 19th century French culture. Anne's interdisciplinary research explores intersections of law, medicine, sexuality, and literature in French during the 19th and 20th centuries. Her work spans multiple genres by centering literary close readings within broader cultural and historical frameworks, and her research includes gender and sexuality studies, historical queer, trans, and intersex studies, and both canonical and lesser-known writers in French. Her first book, Unmaking Sex, offers a cultural history of intersex across medical, legal, and literary discourses. It follows both the lives of those born with bodily sex variations in the past, as well as ideas about non-binary sex during the long 19th century. Her second book project grounds literary imaginings of gender crossings within 19th century technologies that were beginning to realize the potential to modify the body itself. Jen Manion is a social and cultural historian whose work examines the role of gender and sexuality in American life. Jen is author of Liberty's Prisoners, Carceral Culture in Early America, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2015, which received the inaugural Mary Kelly Best Book Prize from the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic. Their most recent book, Female Husbands, A Trans History, published by Cambridge in 2020, was a finalist for the OAH Lawrence Levine Award for the Best Book in US Cultural History and recipient of the Best Book Prize by the British Association of Victorian Studies. Jen is Professor of History and Sexuality, Women's and Gender Studies at Amherst College. Previously, they worked for 10 years at Connecticut College as a faculty member in the History Department and founding director of the LGBTQ Resource Center. Jen received a PhD in History from Rutgers University and a BA in History with an English minor from the University of Pennsylvania, magna cum laude. Thomas Laqueur is the Helen Fawcett Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. His work has been focused on the history of popular religion and literacy, on the history of the body, both dead and alive, and on the history of death and memory. He writes regularly for the London Review of Books, the Threepenny Review, among other journals, and is a founding editor of Representations. Thomas is a member of both the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, but is most proud of the Mellon Distinguished Humanist Award, the proceeds from which he used as seed money for programs in religion, human rights, and science studies at Berkeley, all of which are now self-sustaining. His most recent book is The Work of the Dead, A Cultural History of Mortal Remains, published by Princeton in 2016, and his current research is on the history of humanitarianism and on dogs in Western art. We are very grateful to all of our panelists for taking time out of their very busy schedules to be here today. And I would also like to take this opportunity as we gather here today to celebrate the launch of this important book to thank Anne for all of her hard work in bringing this book to the world. It has been an absolute pleasure to work on this project, and I'm thrilled that we are able to gather here today to celebrate its publication. So without further ado, Anne, I will hand over to you.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, Bethany. I wish to thank my co-panelists, Jen Manion and Thomas Laqueur, for whose work I've admired for years, for their incredible generosity in joining us for this event today, as well as to express my gratitude to my amazing editor, Bethany Thomas, and the whole team at Cambridge University Press for making everything possible. Thank you to all of you who have supported the writing of this book over the years, and especially to our audience who have made time to participate in today's conversation. So thank you and welcome. What is Unmaking Sex about? Unmaking Sex attempts to offer a multidimensional history of intersex by drawing from a broad range of interdisciplinary sources. In so doing, it uncovers the complex history underpinning intersex and trans activism today by exploring both ideas about non-binary sex, and the lives of those born with bodily sex variations in the past. It investigates both medical and legal cases, as well as literary imaginings and autobiographical writings to argue that intersex was central to 19th century debates about science and social order and morality and sexuality that have never completely disappeared, even in our own time. Intersex and transgender are distinct, contemporary terms, yet there's some overlap in 19th century cases between what we would think of today as gender-crossing practices and bodily sex variations, because the sex-gender distinction is a modern construct that hadn't yet been articulated or complicated at that time. And that distinction is also historically problematic in the French language. Jen Manion's work on transing gender has helped me to think about the gender crossing practices of some of the historical and literary figures in my book without imposing contemporary identities onto them. One fictional character that I look at in the book is Clementine from a popular novel by a more obscure novelist, G.P.R. Puissant, from 1820. Clementine is assigned female, but when doctors and then townspeople discover Clementine's bodily variation, Clementine transitions to a masculine identity and clothing in order to escape the ensuing scandal, which also facilitates travel. Here's an illustration of Clementine. I wanted to just show you. Here is Clementine, right here with the sword raised. Some of the historical figures that I examine in the book requested legal sex revisions for economic reasons or to access male privileges of the time. In other instances, personal or romantic desire are referenced as reasons for seeking out medical care in historical cases. For example, Louis-Julia Anna, one of the historical figures that I examine in the book, who's pictured here in a dress and hat, was assigned female, but ended up meeting with a series of doctors who diagnosed her sex differently in each instance as an adult. Gender identity is another contemporary term that's largely anachronistic in the 19th century, but Louis-Julia Anna was quite insistent to doctors that she was a woman, and they describe her existence as exclusively feminine, by which they mean that Louis-Julia Anna conformed to 19th century social expectations for women. She lived as a woman and was to many passing. She had a woman's job and was paid women's wages for them. She wore women's clothes. She also had intimate relations with men. Some doctors, though, viewed Louis-Julia Anna's lived experience as non-conforming or transgressive because she also had at least one male gonad. Louis-Julia Anna traveled throughout northern France and even crossed the border into Belgium with the goal of finding a doctor who would surgically remove her testicle. Was she simply seeking pain relief, or was her aim to facilitate intimate relations with men, as one doctor claimed? It's sort of tempting to wonder whether Louis-Julia Anna was motivated at all or in part by something more akin to our modern concept of gender dysphoria. But I try in the book to think about sex and gender on the terms that would have been available in the past. We cannot know Louis-Julia Anna's precise reasons for seeking to have her body surgically altered because she didn't leave her own writings. My book argues that in spite of the inherent limitations of the medical record, which are many, stories like that of Louis-Julia Anna reveal that people born with intersex traits in the past negotiated binary constructs creatively. The only known first-person account of intersex from 19th century Europe is, of course, that of Herculine Barbin, who was born in France in 1838. To this day, Barbin's birthday on November 8 marks the Intersex Day of Remembrance. The memoirs remind us that behind every medical case study, every court document, every treatise or dissertation, there were historical individuals who experienced triumphs and love and hardship that the medical record can never reveal. Like contemporary intersex folks who are fighting hard to change medical paradigms, Barbin and other subjects described fleetingly by doctors had complex and sometimes conflictual relationships with medicine. The first chapter of my book traces how Barbin's autobiographical writing has influenced the history of sexuality from the time of Barbin's death in 1868. Really, from that moment onward, Barbin's writings became a touchstone for 19th century medical cases that warned about how difficult it was to make sex assignments. Barbin's memoirs became famous for the second time when Michel Foucault republished them roughly a century later, using them to outline his influential historical claim about true sex. As its name suggests, true sex was the idea that sex might be difficult to assign in some cases, but it was absolutely there on the body, and it was up to medical experts to find it. In his preface to the English edition of Barbin's memoirs, Foucault contests the idea of true sex, but he advances the historical argument that by the 19th century, a belief in true sex was already entrenched. I show in the book that when one looks at many more cases over the full length of the long 19th century, that the picture is a little bit more complex than the one that Foucault paints for us. At that time, medical sex assignments relied heavily on the same narrative devices found in contemporary fiction, and they undermined binary thinking in multiple ways. Sometimes doctors were unable to identify and assign a so-called true sex. Other times, their use of narrative lays bare the limitations of their science. The same case might also be taken up again and again by different doctors, as we saw with Anna, with a different outcome each time, unmaking the supposed objectivity upon which the very idea of true sex was predicated. Regardless of what their doctors told them, people born with intersex traits also chose to live their own truths. So there were many more, like Barbin, who may not have left their own writing, but who still have important things to teach us. By showing the complicated and contested nature of true sex, my book tries to disrupt the erasure of the identities and the experiences that this dominant narrative has silenced. When I started working on the book, I was really curious about whether the literary fascination with intersex was related to the incredible profusion of medical cases during the same period. Some of the most famous writers of the time created entire novels in which the sex or gender of the central protagonist was unknown to other characters or to readers. Novelists like Honoré de Balzac, the architect of La Comédie Humaine, the human comedy, imagine characters who existed beyond the gender binary, using the mystery of their gender identity as a page-turning motor for plot. In researching this project, I realized that these very famous novels were actually just the tip of the iceberg. Many more writers imagined the lives and adventures of intersex characters in once popular, but now pretty esoteric texts. Clementine, the intersex hero whom I mentioned above, is actually the first in a long line of these stories. Writers explored prescriptive medical debates about sex in their own way by experimenting on them in fiction with gender nonconforming characters, storylines, and even medically inspired fictional case stories. So I argue in the book that literary androgyny doesn't just build on mythological tropes. Instead, it engages with medical and scientific debates about sexual difference that were circulating at the same time. Today, we think of intersex as an umbrella term for a broad range of bodily sex variations, and people with intersex traits have lived in absolutely every time period. Nevertheless, the word intersex didn't exist before the 20th century, and both the term and its meaning are still being contested. My book relates contemporary intersex scholarship and activism to a number of different historical categories that were used to describe sex variations in 19th century France. Some of these historical labels have been reclaimed by contemporary intersex folks, while they're considered really offensive to others. So because of this, in the book, I use the word intersex analytically rather than as a category of identity to describe individuals with bodily sex variations in the past. Even as I engage with these historical categories, seeking to understand what they meant and how they changed over time, I use contemporary terminology like intersex in my own analysis. And my goal in moving back and forth in this way is to try to be very attentive to cultural and historical specificity, while at the same time not reifying derogatory terms. Examining the ways in which historical categories came into being and shifted meanings helps us to see the past in a more dynamic and nuanced way, rather than as a fixed monolith. And so my work is deeply indebted to both Jen and Tom's scholarship for helping me to understand the past in this way. Jen, in tracking the changing meanings of the term female husband in the US and the UK from its rise in the 18th century to its fall just before the Second World War, and Tom's work in tracing the emergence of the binary model for sex in the 19th century, following a one-sex model that held sex more as a social and cultural marker during earlier periods. We draw from different methodologies and we explore diverse times and places, but each of us speaks to the idea that the sex gender binary was neither natural nor immutable, nor something that has always been with us. And so I almost cannot believe my great good fortune to be able to speak with them and with you today. And so with that, I think I'll pass it on to Jen.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to celebrate your book and to join this conversation. I absolutely love this book. So I'm just going to reflect a little bit on your book and then some of the ways that that you and I, are exploring similar questions. So some of the ways that I think your book speaks to female husbands and help me think a little bit differently about some of these questions. So this remarkable book is an exciting contribution to several important topics of inquiry, most notably challenging a long-standing thesis in the history of sexuality that the 19th century ushered in a clear two-sex model of human difference, and that doctors became invested in the view that each human had one true sex that was discernible. The study is rooted not only in the extensive medical records, over 200 cases, but perhaps even more compellingly explores the relationship between medical research and the proliferation of fiction that incorporated themes of sexual indeterminacy throughout the era. Linton shows us not only that doctors seldom reached a consensus view, but that they often emphasized, quote, similarities between the sexes that in some ways was more consistent with the one-sex model of an earlier era. You suggest that we need to put the concept of gonadal sex in its place, first by looking at a more extensive body of evidence over a longer period of time, but then really by stepping back to see the cracks and the wedges and the weaknesses of this claim. You say, what if instead of interpreting gonadal sex as proof of the medical belief in true sex, we read it instead as a kind of last-ditch attempt to link sex to some bodily truth, however arbitrary, however illogical. And I just want to say, for me as the reader, that is the kind of questioning that makes this book so fun to read, because you just go for it. Like some of these ideas that have just been long accepted in the field, you're like, why? That makes no sense, and let me show you. But you're also super, very careful and meticulous and clear about, what was right about some of those claims too. So I think you just do that very, very skillfully and thoughtfully. Though particular Foucaultian claims take numerous hits throughout the book, a Foucaultian theory of power infuses the analysis as knowledge, scientific understanding, and truth are claimed, contested, and remade. While medical men are the makers of an ever-changing matrix of so-called scientific knowledge about what bodies can and can't do, their views are informed and challenged by their patients and dominant cultural attitudes. Scientific truth is shown to be a social cultural formation, often in the service of norms that constrain and should really be more stable if they are as natural as we are to believe. But what quickly becomes evident is that the sex of bodies scarcely matters in a vacuum. Rather, the sex of bodies becomes relevant when people want to do things like get married. And so, kind of what struck me was how many of the examples that you highlight, well, let me just mention a couple of them for people who haven't had a chance to read the book yet. So you mentioned Anne Linton, and I apologize for my terrible English, not inability to, I did take French in college, so it's even worse embarrassment. But anyway, that they were arrested for, quote, having abused the sacrament of marriage because they were assigned female at birth. They got married as a man. They were tried and convicted, but then acquitted because, quote, he believed himself to be a man and he did not knowingly deceive his wife, right? So this is an earlier example, which I just found incredible because they accepted that his own self-belief trumped the views of others and the materiality of the body. Another example is Anne Jumas, when their husband decided after 2 years of marriage that he wanted an annulment because she, quote, possesses none of the essential organs which are indispensable to characterize the feminine sex and consequently cannot be recognized as a woman. And so again, whether that was the true basis for their husband's displeasure or an excuse scarcely matters, right? The key is that this was a known point of leverage that people could bring forward in the public. And then finally, the French case from 1881 court case that was reported in the New York Times, was another example where someone's sexual indeterminacy was exposed and challenged and interrogated in relation to marriage. So for me, these three examples demonstrate that when cases of indeterminate sex are brought to public awareness, questions of heterosexual marriage were seldom far behind, right? Like, as you said, people sought medical care to make their bodies conform to one sex or the other so that they might comfortably matter. Bodies that didn't function as sexed bodies were expected to become justification for annulment claims. And it's not a stretch to consider that compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory reproduction, which are social, cultural, and economic systems, were really the root causes of the turmoil, right? So these systems, which were supposedly natural and normal, were threatened by bodies that were of doubtful sex. So this just blew my mind as I was, reading your analysis of all these cases, and the inability or refusal of people to clearly conform to one uniform sex gender category threaten the coherence and stability of heterosexual partnerships. So of course, I think there are some parallels and some differences to my work. One of them is the way that people turned on their spouses, right? And so, raising the issue that someone's sex was not what they said it was at the moment of marriage really made the complaining spouse a sympathetic figure who was wronged. And there was a unique way that this functioned in relation to, the expectations bound up in marriage that was different, in other contexts. I think the other thing that you made me think twice about is that I presented marriage as a powerful legitimizing force in the lives of female husbands whose sex gender was less likely to be questioned when they were in a partnership with a woman who vouched for her husband. But in your cases, people are seeking to have medical care to have their bodies conform so that they will be accepted into a heterosexual marriage. And so I just, I'm like torn about thinking that those circumstances in which you presented were harmful circumstances that people found themselves in. But why did I think that the female husbands were different? And I just wonder if there's just a more complicated nuance like truth, maybe for either group of people. The other major contribution of this book is your careful attention to terminology and gendered language, as well as your close readings of how various authors and doctors navigated gender language. In the case of Marie B., who met with Dr. Benoit in 1840, they sought medical help from a different doctor to make her body conform to that of a woman by creating an opening for her vagina. But what you highlight and what jumped out at me is the way Dr. Benoit gendered Marie. So Dr. Benoit determined that she was a man and not a woman, but continued to address Marie as a woman. That you point out was in agreement with the true sex that Marie defined on her own. So I had parallels to that in my work too, but I'll skip over. I realize I'm running out of time. But my other question was, your reflections on working with French language sources and the way people dealt with gender. The 1833 reference where Dr. Bouillard references language itself as hermaphroditic, right? And so this great quote you have where he says, quote, "Since he had a womb, had Valmont menstruated, forgive me this sort of hermaphrodism of language," right? So I saw this kind of juxtaposition of gendered masculine, gendered feminine all the time in newspaper writings, but seldom this kind of self-reflection that he built in, which was like to try to make sense and to take this like medical category to try to make sense of the language that he was using. Finally, I just want to say the care and compassion that you offer your subject. I mean, it is so, and it is so hard to see and uplift humanity in these clinical records that are often cold, judgmental, and dehumanizing. And I think the way that you negotiate it using the analytics that our contemporary terminologies offer us and the insights that we're looking for to help us make connections between past and present while still remaining true to the past and to the terminology of the past and the frameworks and the concepts that people had access to in order to understand their lives, while also then not reproducing violence, right? Which our profession has like done for too long in the interest of like scholarly rigor. So I think that's one of the reasons why your book reads so well in being like both this like really rigorous, meticulous work of scholarship and relevant, speaking to the way we understand these concerns and those of us who identify as trans or intersex or queer in modern times, what some of the connections are and why this work can be relevant. So thank you so much for all of this. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Oh, thank you. And I'm going to take a slightly different approach because I haven't actually worked in this field for a while. And though I appreciate all of the things that Jen said and that Anne said, I was thinking more of talking about why would I recommend this book to colleagues who are teaching courses in 19th century history or gender studies, or even to a general reader. So my comments are really, I wouldn't say outside the field, but are in that context. So the first thing that struck me when I read the book the first time, and again in this time, is its extraordinary empirical richness. I mean, we knew that there was the 19th century was a great period for discussing hermaphrodism, as it's called, and I'll come back to why I think this might be the case. But no one knew of 200 cases and of all these minor novels and of their connection. So I think just as a piece of research and an example of what it is to uncover the past, this is extraordinary. And I value in historical work actually learning something new. By my stage of a career, you almost think you kind of get you've heard it all before. And so works which actually tell you something you didn't know are appreciated. And I think graduate students and other readers of this book, undergraduate, would appreciate that. Second thing I wanted to say is that it's really a terrific work of new historicism. That is a sort of connection between fictional writing on the one hand and medical writing or nonfiction supposedly on the other hand. It really is a piece about the sort of co-generation of stories. The doctor's stories all include all sorts of narratives and all sorts of things about these people, which a novelist would use: how they throw a ball, how they walk, how they look, which aren't facts about biology. And from that, it comes the point that fiction often has sort of indeterminate plots, or plots that require you don't know exactly what they mean and what the point is. And so the idea that no, quote, true sex is, there's no true sex in literature and there's no true sex in medicine, in the same way it's hard to say there's a true anything in literature. It's an interpretive exercise. And by showing that medicine on the one hand and literature on the other is an interpretive exercise, she made a huge point. So true sex never enjoys hegemony because probably no narrative, except under very special circumstances, ever enjoys hegemony for very long. So in part, this absence of hegemony is a consequence of the connection between the literary, the fictive, and the non-fictive. And I thought that was great. The third point on the literary part is the role of facts. And I think in some sense, Anne backslides occasionally. She blames the turn to narrative on the result of scientific gaps or technology that would be needed for sex determination. But I don't think she really means that. I mean, in 1905, one discovers that the role of XY chromosomes in determination of sex among insects. And even in insects, it doesn't get you very far in determining what you think about the sex of insects. People still debating because it depends on narrative. So the real, if we exclude her occasional backsliding, I think what she actually shows is that truth is narratively constructed in all these contexts. Now, I don't want to be soft on the facts, these days, because God knows we all need to stick by facts. But we can say, and I think Anne's work shows this beautifully, in this, that facts are not the fundamentally determinative feature of understanding sexual, either gender identity or sexual identity or any of these cluster of terms. So that's the literary payoff. Then I think payoff for the history of medicine. Jen mentioned the Foucaultian point. What I thought was interesting, was not important to me, was not so much that Foucault's turn to true sex, but this notion that doctors were so deeply implicated in a power knowledge system. Now, they were in some sense, but the interesting thing to me is that these patients came to doctors to deal with actually problems in their lives. And that's true. Harry Osterhuse's book 25 years ago about homosexuality in doctors showed that it wasn't that doctors sort of produced this category to oppress homosexuals, which may or may not in some general case could be argued, but patients came to doctors worried about something, and the doctors helped them or didn't help them. So it's, Jen mentioned this point, it's sort of an interactive relationship between doctors and patients, which, like all interactive relationships, sometimes end up being affirmative and sometimes not. The second point I want to make in the history of medicine is its relationship to the two-sex model with which I'm associated. I don't take the book to be hostile to the two-sex model, and because I don't think, though people have said, I never really thought that the two-sex model was conquered all. In fact, what I think is interesting to me is that the two-sex model generates its opposite, generates what Anne's talking about, which explains why the 19th century is the great century of the investigation of hermaphrodism. For the first 300 years before that, we have a few cases repeated again and again and again. And in the 19th century, because we're meant to have some biological rather than metaphysical account of what sexual difference means, people try to interrogate biology hopelessly. And I think what Anne shows so well is that the hopelessness of that point. Finally, on this point, I want to say, this repeats in some sense what Jen said about marriage. It makes us understand the relationship between medicine and the state. And it's really good at that. The questions that are generated, that produce these cases, are generated by law, and by, not all, some by discomfort, but are generated in sexual object choices, as Anne mentioned, but many of them are generated by the state. So I thought it's extraordinary. In 1899, someone writes about 50 cases of same-sex marriage. These questions are generated by things which the state demands of people, and therefore, and this is the great period also of the rise of jurisprudential medicine, in which medicine becomes an arbiter for all sorts of issues that the state comes to have interest in, including deviant sexuality, but much else. So I did actually rehearse this with a colleague yesterday who teaches gender at Rutgers, and I says, you really need to design this book for the following 3 reasons. So I'm just repeating myself. So I had 2 questions to Anne that I wanted to pose at the end. So at the beginning, she says, why France? And I'm not entirely sure that she quite answers that. And I'd like to just push her on that a bit. On the one hand, we have a hint, it's the civil code versus the common law. I mean, Blackson's account of this is much more sort of open than the Napoleonic, where this is said at some point, then you need to fix it. So that's one argument. The existence of particular literary forms, which are different than German or French or English ones. The natalism problem, though I'm a little dubious about that, Anne raises that it seems to me French have been going on about natalism since the 18th century. They were the first country through the demographic transition, and they've had this issue for a long time. So that would be my first question, the sort of why France. And the other question is maybe too inside baseball, but I think an answer might help even more support her claim. I was struck by how little embryology is discussed in Anne's work. So this is the great century of embryology. She does quote Saint Hilaire, and maybe I missed other quotes. But from the mid-18th century on, discoveries like Wolff and the Wolffian ducts vastly elaborated the common origin of genital anatomy. So the idea of some common confusion, let's say, was there for a long time, and it did more and more of it. My father, in 1935, wrote a dissertation called medical dissertations in German, but I read in English, further studies on the effect of certain hormones on the uterus masculinus, on the male uterus. So 19th century embryology is full of this intersex material. So I'm a little surprised that Anne's sources didn't say more about that. And I'm curious about, could be that embryology doesn't fit into novels. And that's the reason. So that's just maybe an inside baseball. You don't need to answer it. I have other questions if one's short of questions. But anyway, I was very grateful to reading the chance to read this book again. And thank you, Bethany, for inviting me.
Thank you very much, all of you. That's been so engrossing and fascinating already. We have had a couple of questions come through in the chat, but we've still got over 20 minutes left to us. So perhaps, and there's been quite a lot there to get stuck into from Jen and Tom already. Perhaps while some of that's still fresh in your mind, you'd like to sort of pick a couple of things there to respond to.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. There were so many amazing questions that I'll just start with the last one I heard, and then you, Jen and Tom, you can jump back in and tell me what I've left off. I mean, starting with embryology, is crucially important. The androgynous origins of sex, as revealed by embryology, is used as an argument in favor of true hermaphrodism throughout the length of the 19th century. And, as you showed in Making Sex, Tom, that idea was allowed to coexist with the two sex model. Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire's understanding of what he called hermaphrodism in the 19th century in his multi-volume treatise on teratology had really demonstrated the androgynous origins of sexual dimorphism. So everybody was intersex at one point in utero, and he used that argument to theorize what he called hermaphrodism as over or under developments in the typical growth pathways of the human fetus. At the end of the century, I argue that Saint-Hilaire's research was cast in a particularly dark light. Instead of Saint-Hilaire's argument that everybody was once intersex, degeneration theory kind of posited an atavistic return to the non-binary origins of sex. And the claim was that social and moral decay was causing everybody to be androgynous. And this is an especially dark chapter, and it is and something of grave concern during the natality crisis. So embryology comes into the books when doctors are using arguments taken from it in order to make claims about the existence of hermaphrodism. But since, what they called hermaphrodism, but since I'm primarily focusing on instances in which doctors are interacting with patients with intersex traits, the focus is more on clinical medicine. So you see the argument from embryology coming in two places: when clinicians make a claim about the existence of true hermaphrodism, and then also in the iterative attempts to actually change the civil code to add a third category, a non-binary category of sex alongside male and female. Doctors also reference the fact that science had proven that everybody started out as androgynous. And so the code was out of step with scientific progress at that time. What's interesting about the code is that, it both rendered the existence of intersex people fraught because it omitted to mention non-binary sex, and it also disallowed divorce or separation when divorce was illegal because of bodily variations, sex variations. But also, I think the really interesting thing is that there were these medical forensic experts who actually thought that the code itself was a problem, needed correcting. And I think that is the interesting point that I was trying to make about the civil code. What else should I?
France.
Oh, why France? Well, I don't think there's one answer to that. So I think that I answer that question in the book by showing all of, I think there's a combination of factors at play that made the question of intersex particularly poignant and magnified its resonance to a broad audience in France. So some of those factors are just related to history and affect all of France's neighbors, like the changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution that were threatening patriarchal social order, like women entering the workforce, et cetera. There were also factors in the history of medicine that you alluded to, the shift to large hospitals and maternity wards, the ever-increasing venues to publish medical case studies. Those factors affected other countries in Europe, but the civil code was unique to France, and I've just talked about that point. But also there was, there's so many things, novels. Also, I wanted to stress, Herculine Barbin is really central. Herculine Barbin, as we know, was born in France, and the memoirs, the importance of the memoirs really can't be overstated in both the history of what was called hermaphrodism in the 19th century, and then the whole history of sexuality when Foucault leverages the memoirs to make his claim about true sex. And Barbin's memoirs became famous in the 19th century, not because of an example of true sex or this preoccupation with assigning it, but rather there was a lot of publications surrounding the memoirs because doctors realized how difficult it was to make sex assignments and the potentially disastrous consequences of that. Then also in France, certain novelistic forms in the 19th century were really inextricably linked to observation in the natural world. Like even before naturalism and Zola's naturalism repurposed literature as a tool of scientific investigation, Balzac in La Comédie Humaine was trying to study social categories in literature. And La Comédie Humaine, you mentioned Saint-Hilaire, La Comédie Humaine is dedicated to Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, whose son, Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, wrote the definitive work on teratology in the first half of the 19th century. So, I argue in the book that while intersex was increasingly visible in the 19th century because of all these different factors, it was rendered increasingly invisible in the 20th century owing to these medical practices that sought to modify intersex embodiment through medical treatments and surgeries that promoted a practice of hiding the truth about intersex from parents and patients. So to go back to that one claim you made about backsliding, Tom, which I think is important. I do think that beliefs about sex and gender really influenced the ways that historians and literary scholars were writing about representations of intersex. I think that these medical practices that were designed to engender the invisibility of intersex in the 20th century really worked in consort with this dominant narrative of the entrenched nature of binary sex. And that made it difficult for some literary critics to take the question of intersex representation seriously. And I think that has prevented us from seeing some of what these 19th century novels are doing, and probably also some of the ways in which they were probably read at their own time when intersex was increasingly visible and not increasingly invisible. So that's one way I think about some of the things that you
One more point about fact. I think you're totally right about what keeps the narratives from being generated in the 20th century. But what my point was just, the more we know about chromosomes, for example, and molecular biology, and insects and in humans, it doesn't become any easier. So it turns out there's XXY, there's XXXY, there's issues we talked about in our correspondence about adrenal malfunctions. In other words, you can't go from is to ought. That's all I was saying. I think the question of how it's discussed is another issue. I was only trying to say that we can know a great deal about the biology of sex and not decide how we feel about binaryism, intersex, all those issues. That's my only point. I mean, I think your reason why it's not discussed is dead right. I was just suggesting that your point in the 19th century, more technology wouldn't have helped them. They were confused for all the reasons you say they were confused. Or not. It was underdetermined for all the reasons you say.
Right. And I think that one of the parallels, if we could draw a parallel to, our own contemporary moment, I think that there was a realization that these new technologies were just, instead of, solving the mystery as we once thought, they in fact just reveal increasingly complex picture of sex and of sexual difference. And one of the innovations in the 19th century that was histology, it was thought that, they would be able to determine the somatic nature of gonads, but then there's a realization that in fact gonads can be intermediary. There's an ovotestes, and I think that same realization that the more you look, the more complicated it becomes, plays into our own, is something that continues to be true in our own time. When you think about trans participation in sports, or when you think about a lot of debates surrounding trans medicine and I'll stop there. That's kind of a lot. Maybe we should answer some questions from the audience, from Jen.
Yes, I think maybe now we will have a look at some of the questions that we've got in our chat box from the audience. So the first one that we've got here, maybe you could comment on relations between systems or discourses of truth and power underpinned by medical expertise and those underpinned by legal expertise.
Okay. Systems of discourse and powers. Okay, so I talked about the legal landscape a bit already. I'm not sure if that answered part of the question. And as Jen brought up that, the question of marriage and for intersex subjects are really, behind that is also is intensely a fear of protecting heterosexual marriage at the time. So wait, what was the question? What's the difference between?
Comment on relations between systems or discourses of truth power underpinned by medical expertise and those underpinned by legal expertise. So I guess
Okay, well, I think that they're, both of them are power plays, right? I mean, we know that from Foucault and many others. So the fact that the legal code both banished the idea of, both made it impossible to get divorced because of sex variations, and then also didn't mention non-binary sex, necessitated the creation and ensured the power of all of these forensic medical experts who were needed then to make arguments and hand them down to courts so that there could be rulings. So that was created, that was engendered by the code itself. And as I said, the part of that I think is most interesting is the fact that they actually wanted to change the law. So the institution was viewed as problematic because it was falling behind science, and not just intersex bodies, which would have been, the typical, which would have been a more traditional way of thinking about that question, I think. yeah, and then I mean the same thing in medical cases. Doctors are staking their authority on sex determinations, sex assignments, and they're really making hyperbolic claims often that can't be verified because the technology wasn't there to perform abdominal surgeries, for example. Chromosomes and genetics happens much later. But even as Tom said, even when more technological knowledge is uncovered, it doesn't solve the mystery. It just perpetuates the fascination with the subject, I think, and shows that sexual differentiation is really, really complex.
Great, thank you. So our next question from the chat is, I would like to hear about how you would decolonize your work by relating the issues which interest you to the histories of race and colonialism which shaped 19th century French lives. This is important if we are to get beyond the concerns of Anglophone academe and contemporary Anglophone sex gender debates.
I'm so grateful for that question. I'm really glad that that it was asked. And I'm also really grateful to Jen's work that's helped me think more about this. In my next book, I am thinking more about race, which is really important in the cases that I looked at. There are small examples in the book where you see how these arguments about like bouillot, I think that Jen referenced, for example, you can see how the racist discourse of colonial France comes into, filters into the medical diagnosis of sex in different cases. So bouillot, the first time that I encountered the use of the word third sex, bouillot uses a word that's invested in, racism coming out of colonialism. And there are also a lot of references in medical cases about, sort of European fantasies of a hypersexualized colonial subject, women especially, and also bizarre beliefs about how temperature increases supposedly affected genital growth in different ways. So that aspect is definitely present in the medical cases, but it was less clear in most of the literature that I was looking at, and a lot of the medical cases were published in Paris. So that's something I'm thinking more about, and I'm really glad that you asked that question.
Great, and then we've got one more question in the Q&A box. So I can't wait to read your book, Anne. So glad to hear Jen and Tom's responses. I wondered, hearing you talk about why France, but not yet having read the book, whether the heightened research on venereal diseases in France dovetails with the doctors working on or writing on intersex patients. And also just to agree, the clinic system in France is very much part of looking inside bodies. And of course, novelist Eugene Sue's dad and granddad were both major figures in that kind of anatomical teaching, and Eugene himself was expected to follow in their footsteps. Balzac only wished to have had that as a legacy.
Okay, yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you, Jan, so much for your kind words and for that that question. Absolutely, that is something that I omitted to mention. There were many reasons why France that I do mention in the book, but that I didn't in my very long response to why France. Somehow forgot about venereal disease. How is that even possible in the 19th century? Yeah, so patients didn't just come to doctors and request, surgeries in the case of Louis Julia Anna, or help with a legal sex revision. Sex variations were also discovered inadvertently because of venereal disease or for some other unrelated reason in hospitals. And the poor that were filling these public hospitals became huge numbers of patients enabled there to be more and more cases, and enabled their doctors to have a realization that that these variations might be incredibly common, in fact, much more common than people had originally assumed. Also, in the case of Erculine Barbin's memoirs, the first thought of the doctor who discovers Barbin's body tragically after the suicide is that this must have been a case of syphilis, and that Barbin probably committed suicide in order to, cut short the suffering from syphilis, because it was so widespread at the time among the literati as well, as Jan knows. But in fact, I mean, that's how the discovery of Barbin's intersex variation was discovered in the 19th century. So absolutely related, and just important to stress that it wasn't just patients coming to doctors, that they were also, subjected to medical treatment against their will as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And I can't quite believe this, because it's been such an engrossing hour, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of the conversations that could have been had here, but we are at the end of our hour. So just thank you so much to all of our panelists. It's been absolutely fascinating. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here today and to contribute. And just to thank Anne again as well for her care and her intelligent and sensitive work in bringing such an important book into the world. So the book is available now around the world. Don't forget about our discount code, and it really is a wonderfully engaging and hugely informative read. So if you'd like to hear more about the things that everyone's been talking about today, then please do go and have a look for that. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today, and wishing you all a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.